So, hi everybody, why don't we get started? I'm James Heimowitz, I'm the president of China Institute. A big welcome to you all. Thank you for putting up with our temporary space. For those of you who've been here, you walk up. We're just going to start building out actually the area right behind here and soon to be downstairs. So we're hopefully going to get connected with the street. Just when we deal with the city, we've got some substantial funding from the city. The cultural affairs the process takes a little bit longer. And I'm especially delighted to welcome this evening's panel of discussion. China and the United States, it's a tough time. I lived in China for 33 years. I've been going back and forth from New York to China since 1967. And I think arguably this is the toughest I've seen it, even through the Cold War, even through the Cultural Revolution, even through all kinds of horrible things that we've experienced. I think we know each other a little bit better now. And because we know each other a little bit more, that's why I'm a little bit more nervous. I'm nervous because both sides ought to be behaving in a different kind of a way. We ought to be realizing and understanding that the United States and China are the two most important countries to occupy this planet. And we have to figure out a way to collaborate on the things that we can collaborate on. That doesn't mean we're not going to have differences of opinions. That doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything. But it does mean that for the sake of this planet, we need to figure out a future understanding that we're going to share this planet. It doesn't really matter who's number one and who's number two, in which order. If we don't resolve some of the biggest issues that face us, it's not going to be a very nice place. So I'm delighted that we can collaborate. We've got a very in-depth, multicultural, multi-perspective team here. We've got, we'll actually let Dinda go and introduce the panel itself. So let me first introduce Dinda, because Dinda has been helping us bring China to life. And for those of you who were here on this Saturday, we just had a Food and Ideas Expo that was unbelievable. We not only got to taste and experience some foods, but delve into a very important cultural side, green aspects, food aspects. In fact, you can see some of the remnants of it still downstairs with the paintings on the wall. And I just want to have a shout out to our trustee, Mike Krupa, who's here. That's our finance committee. So the tough questions about finance are coming from that direction. So without further ado, let me introduce Dinda, who will tell you more about the evening.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Dinda Elliott, as James said. I'm the director of programs here, and we just have an amazing panel of speakers tonight. Rebecca Fannin is really the woman of the night because her book, Tech Titans of China, has just come out, and we'll be talking about that. And Rebecca is, she's a really a leading expert on global innovation, but she is a writer, a technology writer, an author, and a media entrepreneur. And I think most famously, she founded a media and events platform called Silicon Ventures, which publishes a weekly e-newsletter, produces videos and podcasts and programs, and produces events annually. I will say that really what she's created is quite incredible because she produces these events all over the world, and Silicon Dragon has become the platform for important and interesting conversations about technology in China and around the world. So it's quite an amazing thing. She's been following the tech scene in China forever, and so we're delighted to have her today.
Before it was a tech scene, right?
Even before it was a tech scene, right, exactly. And we also have Wei JIANG, who also has an amazing background. He's a venture capitalist who has a new company called Momentor Ventures. But Wei has incredible experience both working for American technology companies and founding technology companies in China. And so he can speak to all angles of this conversation. And we're just absolutely delighted to have you here tonight. We've got an amazing moderator tonight as well, and that is Yoon-hee Kim, who is the technology editor at the Wall Street Journal, and she produces also, in addition to having lived in Hong Kong for 12 years, covering China's tech scene for the past more than a decade, so she knows the ins and outs of the tech scene as well, and she also helps produce these enormous, important conferences on global technology for the Wall Street Journal. So we're just delighted to have these three incredible experts. Please come up, and without further ado.
Thank you so much, Linda. It's great to be here, and welcome to our event. Rebecca, I read your book over the weekend, and
you're a
What
speed
I have to say
reader.
is you have to hold the mic up close
Okay.
to your mouth. Yep, thank you.
Read it in 3 days, and I wanted to start off with a quote from Rebecca's book. In the final chapter of her book, she writes, "China's rapid rise as a tech superpower is challenging America's status as the world's technology leader and could lead to a shift in global economic dominance." And this statement is really, really powerful. And just to give you some data, last year, VC spending in China reached $105 billion, just shy of the $111 billion raised in the US. So the figure is quite close to the amount that was raised in the US. And last year, China had 86 unicorns. And I'm sure you all know what unicorns mean, but they're startups valued at $1 billion or more. And that number compares to 151 for the US. So clearly the technology gap between the US and China is narrowing. And Rebecca details just how much success China has had over the last decade in raising the bar when it comes to really innovative technology. So I wanted to start off the conversation tonight to talk about how did China get to where it is today? And Rebecca, maybe you can talk about what is the secret to these tech companies' success in China?
Well, the subtitle of the book is how China's tech sector is challenging the world by innovating faster, working harder, and going global. And these are three aspects of why China's getting ahead. This whole 996 entrepreneurial culture, the innovations that are spewing forth. China has gone from copying to innovating today, and innovating in a number of areas and a number of business models. And some of these startups are starting to go global now today as well. And we're seeing, for instance, TikTok. How many people here are on TikTok or have seen it? Okay, a few. Well, this is one of these Chinese tech startups that's gone global, and it's from this company called ByteDance, which is the #1 unicorn in the world, valued at $75 billion. And some people say that ByteDance is the new B of the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent. So I do track that because I've been covering venture capital and the tech economy for China for a number of years. And I've seen the progression. So I've seen the progression from the original bot, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, that I know all of you know here, to a whole new group of newcomers. The TMD, Toutiao, Meituan, Didi, Xiaomi, SenseTime, JDI, and DJI as well. Many of these companies have emerged as unicorns, and we just heard the unicorn numbers, and China has gone to being the world's #2 patent filer in the world, and is catching up to the US on national R&D spending, and has already caught up to the US on a number of other indicators, such as the world's fastest supercomputers. So all of this is documented in my book, and I've had the pleasure and opportunity to be there on the ground interviewing a number of these tech entrepreneurs and their venture investors over the years. So I've seen the progression pretty much from a grassroots perspective. And I also have the Silicon Valley perspective, so I can see it in relation to Silicon Valley. And I see that China's tech innovation is really beginning to challenge Silicon Valley for global leadership, and that's what I write about in the book. And I think it's a real wake-up call for the US now.
You talked earlier about the 996. How many of you know what that means? Okay, fair number of you. So that means 9 days?
Yeah.
9 a.m. to 9
9 a.m. to 9 p.m.
6
days a week.
Right.
Yeah.
But
So-
I say it's more like 10, 10, 7.
10 times 7.
10 is now it's 007.
007. Okay.
Implying that the Chinese work way harder than
They
maybe
do.
the Silicon Valley startup founders.
Oh, I think so. You see empty parking lots on the weekends in Silicon Valley, and people don't take time off on the weekends in China, right?
Yeah. Evenings.
Not evenings, not Sundays, maybe a little bit Sunday morning, 7 to 8 a.m.
So I have a good friend.
Hold the mic up to your mouth. Yeah.
A colleague from my Google days. She had a startup, and she was trained at Google, so because she does one-on-ones, right, manager one-on-ones. So her new rule is, I will still do one-on-one, only if you schedule it after midnight. and you have to work until midnight, then you earn your right to do what I want to do. So that's one example.
That's a good example. But what do you think are the key differences between US entrepreneurs and Chinese entrepreneurs beyond the level of hours that we put into work? Because innovation just doesn't come from, of course you have to work hard, but you also have to have creative ideas. And for many years, I think a lot of people thought that the Chinese were just copying products and services that were initiated in the US. Do you think that mentality has changed?
Oh yeah, I do think it has changed. I think we've gone from the era of all these tech models from the US being copied. Facebook copied, Amazon copied, Google copied, YouTube copied, and many of these original Chinese entrepreneurs were educated in the West and were trained in the West, and then they went back to China when the entrepreneurial boom started, and it was easy for them to create these startups and just ride the wave because they were the first ones in. Today, the landscape has totally changed, and this is one reason I needed to write this book, because the landscape has really changed, and it's become much more innovative today and much more competitive, where, look, maybe you had that first advantage as a newcomer, but today, to get in, you need a niche, and you need to be ferocious, and some of these entrepreneurs are really ferocious, price wars, and I know Wei can talk about that. He's seen it in talent races. So it's amazing. It's much more, it's far fiercer than what we have here in the West.
Wei, what are your thoughts about?
Yeah, so when I did my startup, which was late 2005, all we were doing was C2C, right, which means copy to China.
Not consumer to consumer.
Right, not but even back then, if you look 1 or 2 layers below, it was never straight copy, right? Straight copy never worked. And localization was never a trivial work. So that's why Alibaba took some advantages, and then beat eBay, which was my employer back then. And then there are countless examples of that. So, if you understand that, even back then, you would never doubt the innovative power of the Chinese entrepreneurs. And then after a while, they copied everything they could, and then there's still business opportunities to do, right? Then what they do, right? They innovate, even invent something that unheard of from here, right? So if you look at the landscape today, China, right? In many sectors, in some sectors, the Chinese are often innovating anybody in the world, right? So, for example, e-commerce, in some parts of e-commerce, I'll give you some examples if you're interested. In some part of social, in mobile payment, of course, right? People don't use cash anymore in China for the last few years, which also enabled paid content and also short form videos, right? There are many areas China is absolutely leading. Even for me, now that I'm an investor, I look for clues, right? Whatever works in China, can they work in the US? For example, one thing lately is community e-commerce. So this is where you put some distribution centers, smaller ones and bigger ones in some neighborhoods. And that's where you work with the 7-Elevens of the world in the neighborhood, right? You reduce the fulfillment cost by a lot, make it a fraction of what it is. So now that's taking hold. So with that new business model, you can really serve the small communities, even village level, right? So the Chinese e-commerce is no longer just serving the big cities. I think to some extent it's still happening. It's still this case in the US, right? They're going deep, right? The third tier cities, fourth tier cities in the village. So I think these things, I'm looking for ways to not really copy but inspire the US startups.
And when you actually look at some of the next generation technology companies that come after Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, for instance, Didi, ride-hailing company in China, Meituan Dianping that does group buying and food delivery. So a lot of these companies are not profitable yet, even though they are innovating. So that's a problem, right? If you create something innovative, but you can't make a profit. So what are your thoughts about how they develop and grow beyond what they've developed currently, Rebecca?
Definitely now growth is the priority. And if you look at Amazon, it took years for Amazon to turn a profit. These companies are trying to get big as fast as possible and grab turf. And that's the #1 priority. Making money will come later.
But there are examples of companies like Ofo, the bike sharing company that bike sharing was a big phenomenon in China several years ago, and folks in the US ended up copying that model, but now they are struggling, they can't make a profit.
Yeah, they overexpanded.
Right.
They went international too fast, and their management team was too young. And I know Wei can talk more about it because it's his,
We lost all the money.
his portfolio company.
So take us back. I mean, Wei, you decided to invest in a company that looked promising, but that investment didn't pan out as you expected.
You mean the OFO, right?
OFO.
Yes. So it wasn't my personal investment, it was my colleague. But still, it was one time one of our superstars. And maybe 100x at some time. Then we ended with nothing, basically. So what really happened, I think the idea is still valid. But they didn't do one thing that Chinese innovators or entrepreneurs do best, right? Keep rapidly evolving and then or pivoting, as we say. So they stop pivoting. They focus on every ounce of their energy on raising capital and try to bury their competitor, which in Opal's case, their competitor is the mobile.
Hold the mic higher.
And then, sorry, I need to, yeah. In that case, they always thought, maybe I can bury my competitor in the next 3 months, and then I'll really focus on my business model, make it economically viable, right? So if you compare that to Line, which is maybe a copycat in the US, they think the unit economics works better in the US per ride. They were going to charge $1 instead of 1 RMB in China, right? So that can cover the back's cost and labor cost. Now they're charging $2, I think. And then the other thing they figured out clearly is, so far, right, is that so one big hurdle for the business model is, if you place all your bicycles in the center of the city, after 4 days, somehow they all disperse in the suburbs, right? It's a mystery to me. Why do people ride them at home and not ride them back, right? But it is the case. So one big task for any of these companies would be carry these bikes back to the center city, right? Which is very labor intensive and also damaging to the bicycles. So Flying Back now has a scooter, right? It's electricity powered. So then the scooter is going to be full. So then they talk to the Uber driver, Lyft driver, and say, look, why don't you guys, you see them, put it in your trunk, and the better yet, take it to your home and charge it, so they'll pay you for it. Right? So that is the model, that part worked. But Mobile and the Ofo were not stupid. Right? They're just basically focusing on burying the other party. So back to Rebecca's earlier point, I think part of it, the investors were at fault. We really didn't encourage the detailed work, the solid work, right? So we're looking at this, and we're self-criticizing too.
And they raised so much money, they had all this cash
Billions.
to burn. And so
Yeah.
there was
And they burned them.
let's do this market, let's do that market.
They burned them quickly.
They
And
burned
as soon as
quickly.
we figured out, the Opal guy, a young guy, like that, right?
Yeah.
So as soon as we figured out they were spending their user deposit, security deposit, right? Shoot, this is over, right?
So as an investor who's constantly looking out for the next big thing, how do you avoid a situation like UFO? What do you look for now? What are you more careful about? When you talk to founders, what do you actually ask them?
It's a hard question. I think part of it has to do with the industry. How the overall trend is, how everybody's behaving, and I think it happens not just in China. If you look at WeWork, so that's a similar situation.
WeWork just is delay their IPO.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think the original valuation was 47 billion, and then
Yeah,
they wanted to cut it in half, 25 billion, and then they said, look, that's not good. Maybe 11 to 15 billion, and then now they said that's not good. We go hold it back. So just imagine if you're a late-stage investor, right? The anxiety you have. So I think overall the industry has learned their lessons for now, right? Maybe after a couple of years, everybody forgets. Also, I think the money is no longer there in China. So right, the climate change, figurative climate change has happened in the investment sector too.
With as you mentioned, the economy slowing down and the trade war with the US, are we likely to see more difficulties for a lot of these Chinese tech firms as they try to expand overseas? I know that for many years, companies like Alibaba and Tencent have tried to venture into the US without much success, and they ended up going into Southeast Asia, thinking that Southeast Asia might be a very similar market to China, but they haven't made a profit there. What are the future prospects for tech companies in China, given this current difficult environment?
Well, their model has been to acquire these companies. Like Alibaba has acquired look-alike e-commerce companies in Southeast Asia. Doing the same thing in the US is very problematic today. It's not going to get passed. Alibaba's deal to buy MoneyGram even was squashed a couple of years ago. So this has led companies like Alibaba to turn elsewhere to other markets, to Israel and to Southeast Asia for growth. They need the growth. They do want to go global. It is a struggle to go global. And what they're doing is investing in acquiring companies, not really planting their own stamp there, but acquiring look-alike companies. Whether that model is going to be successful long-term, the jury's still out, I think. But to go after the Southeast Asian market is smart because it is very similar to China in that it's growing very fast, it's very digitally savvy, and it's all mobile. So, and the same trends that happen in China tech are now happening in Southeast Asian tech by some of the same investors even.
Wei, do you think it's the right strategy to invest in companies in Southeast Asia rather than building an infrastructure from ground up?
Yeah, I think so, but part of it, I'm not sure it's by choice. It's more difficult to invest in the US, right? There's a CTS reform law passed last year, signed by the president. So it's virtually impossible for the Chinese funds to invest in the US, especially technology startups. And then where do you go, right? So China is not having a good time inside of China. And then you go to Southeast Asia, you go to Africa. But if you look at the data though, the two biggest economies are still the US and China, right? So I've seen this data in the past, in the first 20 years of the internet economy. So that's from 95 to 2015. The new economy, like the internet, has created new value up to $5 trillion. And the following 20 years, right, there are 25 trillion more to be created. But where has the money been created, right? So 64% was created in one place, that's the US, and 28% was in China. So add them two together, that's 92%. And with the decimal points, right, close to 93%. And Europe was 3%. Rest of the world, 4%. They're not relevant, right? And imagine next 20 years, right? China will not be less than half the size of the US, right? So if you have a choice, where do you focus? US and China, right? So you go to the Southeast Asian countries, I think Rebecca's right. So they're doing that, but can they really afford, can the markets really afford to have big unicorns? I'm not sure, right? So their population is there, but I'm not sure they have a big enough unified market, just like Europe. So, so I'm not really optimistic about that. I think there's business to do, but the size of it is questionable to me.
Companies like Huawei, though, have found success in Europe, for example, with their smartphone business as they struggle in the US.
Yeah, but still they're very powerful in China, right? I think if I was Apple, I'd be scared because the fashionable ladies are using Huawei. I mean, you know, to me it's no surprise, right? You know, I take a Huawei, I have a Huawei phone, I use it in China. Every time I take a selfie, you know, I look much better than I am. I have no wrinkles, you know, so of course they're popular.
So you think the technology is way better than Apple?
I'm not sure technology is better, they're just, you know, closer to customers. You know, the vanity effect.
I read somewhere that the US-China trade war is actually helping Huawei in China because the Chinese are very nationalistic and they're going out and buying more Huawei phones.
I'm not sure how much is the nationalistic element or how much is the vanity effect. But they do have great cameras, right? Then they have the software that, you know, make you look better.
They do have a partnership with Leica. I think that's why the cameras.
That Leica.
Leica.
Yes.
Just going back to the trade war, I mean, Huawei's in the center of this US-China trade war. The US government has placed Huawei on the entity list, which means that every company that has to ship components to Huawei now has to get a license. Things have kind of softened a bit, but still quite difficult. I mean, when you're looking at a global tech supply chain, do you think that it is possible for the Chinese to secure all of their components on their own for their devices in the future? I mean, we saw with Huawei that a lot of their components actually are from the US. And the trade war actually ended up hurting a lot of the US companies.
It's true, and it's pushing China to be more self-reliant and to develop its own technologies. So for instance, you see Huawei developing its own operating system for its smartphones. It has been reliant on the Android system, but now it's developing its own. And I think we're going to see this play out in other sectors as well.
Yeah, so
But can that, let's say Huawei's operating system goes global, do you think consumers will choose Huawei's operating system over Android or iOS?
Well, it won't go global, it won't go in the US.
Right, but let's say they're trying to make a
But
move
it
in
already,
Europe.
I mean, it already is a leading smartphone maker. I mean, Huawei ranks way up there. I think it's second in the world, right behind Samsung. It's huge. It's just we don't like them in the US. We're not going to allow them to sell in the US. The phones have been yanked from Target retail shelves, and look, Huawei is going to go where the markets are, and it is going to create, which I've heard this term now a few times, the Splinterville, or splinternet of two tech worlds, a China and Asian world and a Western world. We're starting to see this happen already. It's happening in venture capital too, and it's not just smartphones, but it'll be in semiconductors, it'll be in robotics, it will be in AI. Many of the important tech sectors that are emerging for the future, I think, are at risk of this splinter net development.
So as consumers and companies, you think we will have to eventually choose two different
Yes.
systems and internet?
It could lead to that.
Right.
It could lead to that. AC/DC, which one are you going to go?
Right.
You know, look, I remember.
Well, that's bad for innovation, right?
Right, GSM and CDMA, those were two different standards for phones, and that happened. So there's precedence here. It could happen again. And because China is now the #1 challenger to the US for global tech dominance, this could have a real impact on our own technology innovation, our own leadership. I think this really is a wake-up call for the US, and it's not getting enough attention. It's starting to now. I think that the whole idea of China innovation in the first place was seen as a very ridiculous idea 15 years ago. It was ridiculed, but today, no, it's no longer ridiculed, and people are threatened by it. Silicon Valley, I think, is very threatened by this rise in China, and this is why we're seeing this tech Cold War play out, or maybe you don't call it a war, you call it a conflict.
When you're looking at the future technologies or frontier technologies, such as AI, robotics, 5G is becoming a big topic that everyone's talking about today. Do you think that China has a chance to actually lead in this space going forward, and if so, why? Or do you think US will ultimately win?
Yeah, I think to go back a little bit on the previous question, I feel the separation, if there's an eventual separation, is really not by choice. So it is detrimental to Huawei and many other technology companies. Let's just use one example, since you mentioned, you guys mentioned the operating system. So I used to work at Google, and then I work with Huawei and GTE very closely. So we understand the situation. So what happened is, if you look at Android, which is operating system, Android is open source, but on top of it, there's a GMS layer. That's not open system. GMS layer is the Google made, where they have 70-some functions, where it tells you your location, your acceleration. There's 70-some functions. So that's not open. And then built upon that is really the Google Play, which is the App Store. So for all the Chinese cell phone manufacturers, they can freely use the Android operating system, but not the GMS, not the Google Play Store. So that actually is kind of is suboptimal for user experience. You may have some malware issues, you have some other issues. When Huawei in China can still freely use Android system, and they have a home system which is not really well received recently, right? So I agree with Rebecca. So I don't think they'll ever go global, and I don't think there will be many developers who care to develop apps on top of it, because there's no money to be made and no users. So it's a forced step they must take, right? Otherwise, what they do. And then even on the software, on the hardware part, I don't think they are waiting to just go on their own and make all the things. One thing, if we break down, the Chinese and the U.S. tech industry, right? We compare them. Some of the advances that we observe in China are still the business model, margin improvement. So there are pros and cons on both sides, right? So the Chinese are not really super humans. They made some progress, but once you understand why, it's not really a big surprise. So I feel the current climate is detrimental to the collective good. They'll have to go on what they do, but not really by choice. I hope there won't be a total separation, in the internet world. Otherwise, there's inside China is also suboptimal because you still have.
But isn't that coming in 5G anyhow, a separation? You have to go with the Huawei or not go with Huawei. Your choices are Huawei, Nokia, or Ericsson. The US doesn't even have a company in there that's competing.
So what I understand is Huawei is still following a globally recognized protocol. So ideally, you can use Huawei in China, and then you can use 5G outside of China once they're ready. I think that's what the CEO is trying to advocate.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are many caveats, in all these things. But it's just very tricky to figure them out.
So when looking at the frontier technologies like 5G,
Sorry.
where does
Okay.
China stand right now? And
Yeah.
given what's happening with the trade war, will that hinder efforts for Huawei to be able to become a leader in 5G?
I think if you look at what the Chinese tech sector is good at, is that they can assemble a lot of resources and then focus on one area. And then, if it's not really dependent on many other sectors, then they can do it. If this relies on the best chips, best whatever hardwares, then they'll still have to struggle. Because U.S., in comparison, we should say something positive about U.S. Right?
Right, yeah, let's do that.
So in comparison, U.S. is really good at a few things. One is the R&D is still the best. Education system right, is still the best. And then also the people do have longer term thinking, and then they're willing to do to take a risk for the longer term gains. Right? You don't see very much of that in China. Right? And also the social structure seems to be more stable. Right? Even if you make longer term bet, chances are if you actually make it, you benefit from it. These are also the talent pool is a lot deeper here. Right? So earlier what we say is China enjoys some benefits, hardworking and super practical, right? Entrepreneurs. Yeah, so they clearly say, look, we don't do aim and shoot, we shoot and aim. And then one of my earlier story was when I was at eBay, we competed against Alibaba, and then so we lost, and I left eBay a couple years after, and I didn't see any home. So a few years after I left, Alibaba took one of my guys. We were category management, so the heart and soul of the platform. So they took one of my guys over, and 3 months into the new job, right, he's making friends. He's having a dinner and then had a little bit too much to drink. So then he said to his colleagues, I can't believe you Dong actually beat eBay. Right? Next to nothing. And they all laughed. Yeah, we beat eBay, but we're faster. So they were fast. Right? They didn't know all the knowledge. It didn't matter. They tried and pivoted, and they eventually beat eBay. So that story goes to many local companies when they compete against the US companies.
Yeah, like the Uber and Didi's case study that I talk about in my book, of Didi taking over Uber in the long run. They were just outmaneuvered and outpriced as well. But I did want to mention something on the 5G. All these countries have to decide which system they're going to go with. And so Japan and Australia have decided they're not going to go with Huawei's system. Canada's still deciding, US decided they're not going to, but I think a number of other markets are still deciding. And so this will create this division of 5G. And 5G, I guess, if you don't know what it's going to do, it's going to speed up all of our connections and make us seem very slow right now on all of our internet, and it will connect every IoT device, your refrigerator, your car, we're just going to be like this.
And autonomous vehicles, right? For
And
those
yes.
to work, actually, you do need a 5G
Yeah,
connection.
many things will become doable with 5G.
We talked a lot about China, but I also wanted to shift the focus to talk a little bit about the US. Many US companies have had difficulties penetrating in China, but Rebecca, you mentioned a few really good examples in your book. WeWork, Starbucks, Airbnb, LinkedIn.
Yeah.
They're kind of rare companies that have had success. So, in your opinion, if you were to give advice to businesses that are trying to expand in China today, under this current environment of the US-China trade war, what would you tell them?
Well, look, as Starbucks got in very, very early, 20 years ago or more, and they're just on almost every street corner now in Shanghai and Beijing, but they haven't kept up the innovation pace. So when you're in China, that's number one. And a company called Luckin Coffee has outmaneuvered them and out-innovated them with this on-demand, mobile on-demand delivery of coffee. And Starbucks is now copying the Chinese competitor, so staying innovative is number one. WeWork has been expanding very aggressively in China, and I've seen many of their WeWork spaces, and in fact, we've actually held events in the WeWork spaces in China, and they're marvelous. But they also have local competitors that may, there's one company that I can think of that I do write about in the book called New Commune, which is very heavily funded, and it's started by a very aggressive Chinese entrepreneur. So competing against these Chinese entrepreneurs, I think a lot of the American companies really don't know what they're getting into when they go over there. And LinkedIn, the same thing. LinkedIn exists, but it's mostly popular with the expat audience. What happened there is that WeChat became the ubiquitous messaging app, and LinkedIn, and WeChat is used for business and consumer and personal use. LinkedIn is mainly a expat tool. It's very popular among all the expats I know in China, and I use it a lot when I'm there too. I use WeChat too, but LinkedIn, since I can't get on Twitter and Facebook and Google in China, LinkedIn is my default. But I think LinkedIn has struggled to get the right management in place. Many of these companies have not chosen the right managers to really execute, and execute very quickly like a Jack Ma would. And they have not been visionary, they have not been close enough to the community to understand what the consumers really want. So American companies are still struggling to get, in this tech space, these Silicon Valley companies are struggling for the most part in China.
What are the prospects for Facebook and Google in the future? There's been a lot of talk about them potentially.
Oh boy.
I need to show you my scars. Yeah, I worked at Google for 6 years. It was tough. So it's very politically sensitive. So that's why it's tough. So there. The question is very interesting. Comparing U.S. and China. I think Rebecca shared why some of the U.S. companies fail in China. And to me, if you look at enough of these guys, example, you can compile a error list, just like if you're a programmer, you have all the errors. So they're altogether, I think, 6 or 7. On the top would be product, not localized enough, not nimble enough. And there's a big one. To me, that's field commander, right? You said, is that leadership in place. But the field commander needs to be very decisive, with your decision power, obviously.
Because I think in eBay's case, didn't they have to get every approval from Silicon Valley?
Of course.
So it slowed them down considerably.
Yeah, so there are a lot of stories there too. One time our CEO, Meg Whitman, I love her, she was so frustrated when she realized that, even for a small wording change, it took 9 months.
Wow.
And a lot of colorful stories there. But also, we didn't really have a local guy in place. We had another gentleman from another Asian country back in China. So they looked similar to us, but not really. I wanted to bring the other side of the coin, which is now that a lot of Chinese companies are coming over to the US. And the reason is, the domestic market is so competitive, right? And there are a lot of issues, like trust issues, other regulatory issues. So they're coming out, right, the rest of the world. And with the understanding, if you want to, not conquer the world, but get a big share of the rest of the world, US is a must. You get US, you get more than half the job done. So to us, there seems to be a parallel universe. One being China, one being the rest of the world. You can be successful in China, that doesn't mean you're successful in the rest of the world, vice versa. So I look forward to the day, and I even hope, I hope more that I can be part of it, that one company can do well in both markets, right? Then that's a $1 trillion company. Yes, so I hope I can live to see that day. But then the challenges are so obvious, for the Chinese entrepreneurs coming over to the US. If you think about eBay, Google, and others, right? They have some good leadership in place in the headquarters. They have good management practice, leadership practice, and they have systems, right? But in many cases in China, including some famous well-known companies, they really didn't have a good management system. If you look closely, right? Now they're coming over to the other side of the ocean. Imagine the challenges. They're having more challenges than the US companies going to China. So again, nobody's invincible. So yeah, I look forward to see they learn faster, they learn more, they do well in the US.
Apple, for many years, was seen as a big success story in China, but now it's struggling quite a bit. What are your thoughts about Apple's prospects in China in the future?
Pricing.
They're just too expensive? Or?
Well, I mean, for a while it was a badge of honor. That's the only phone you could have in China. But today, it's I think even in the U.S. too, Apple's glory is not what it was. And in China, it's carried over.
I think the other issue I see is what Rebecca was saying about Starbucks. They were doing so well, then they lost touch. Because consumers are evolving, right? So, I use the example of Huawei's phone. Huawei's phone, in general, are not that nice looking, right? Not well as well designed as Apple. They're a lot better today, but they have great cameras. And then, so if your belief as an industrial designer, product designer, is that we want to reflect a true picture, then you'll be wrong. Right? People don't want to have true pictures. They want to have beautiful pictures.
Well, and the other thing is that there's another Chinese startup, Xiaomi, which has done very well on pricing, right? And
Xiaomi is doing well on pricing. But if you look at the high-end Huawei phones, they're just as expensive as Apple 11. So they're selling well, and they're becoming a fashion statement among the ladies. Right? So that's, to me, very scary if I was Apple.
aside from the trade war.
Yeah, it's really, back to the basics, you gotta give consumers what they want.
And now China has implemented this rule where data has to be stored locally. And so
That's
that
like GDPR.
Right, so that could present more problems for foreign firms looking to enter. They may not want to agree.
Yeah, I see that as a huge issue. Even any company that does business with Alibaba, they have to know that Alibaba owns that data and not you dealing business with them. It's Alibaba.
Yeah, but for companies, this is nothing new, right? They have to deal with GDPR in Europe anyway. So that's the way the world's going. So
We're going to open it up for audience questions in a little bit, so please get your questions ready. But before that, I wanted to ask you, looking at the next, you have a whole section, Rebecca, in your book about the next generation of startups that you think are very promising, companies like DJI, drones, robotics companies. What are their prospects? I mean, DJI has had some success in the U.S. with their drones.
Yeah, DJI is a startup from Shenzhen, and it's the world leader in drones. It's very innovative, not just for the consumer world, but for business world. And it started by a young Chinese entrepreneur, straight out of college. And he is a very private individual, very tough to get an interview with.
Frank Wang, right?
Yeah, he's, look, a lot of these Chinese tech entrepreneurs, they're techies. They're not really business people. Most of them are techies. And I talk a lot about it in the book. I write a lot about it in the book about the electric vehicle market being developed by technologists rather than automakers. And that gives, I think, China an advantage because they don't have to leapfrog over their gas-powered engines. that they can go straight to electric cars and autonomous driving. So you're seeing a lot of electric car makers or vehicle makers developing very fast, 40 of them in fact. Many of them are already doing R&D in Silicon Valley and talking about some of the problems that these Chinese companies have in the US. Some of them have been accused, or their engineers have been accused by Tesla and others of, hey, you've stolen our stuff. And so there's several lawsuits that are pending like that. But I think that on the positive side for the US, I think Wei's right, that we do continue to have the R&D lead. But to get back to your question on these Chinese tech companies that are coming up, many of them are very well financed. They're in AI, such as SenseTime, which is in facial recognition, and Face++, which is in speech recognition. AI is very developed in China. Mobile payments is another area. There are many, the bike sharing area we already talked about, that originated in China and carried over to the West. And I have a whole section in the book on the tech sectors that matter most and talk about those companies that are the most related to those sectors, such as e-commerce. Alibaba is no longer just the big elephant out there. They have a very strong local competitor. It's a startup, 3 years old, in the social commerce area that has risen very quickly in 3 years and went public in New York last year. And it has a new business model that we don't really have here in the West, of combining e-commerce and gaming and socializing and celebrity influencers. So there's still a lot of new business models originating in China today, and I think we'll continue to see that. TikTok is one of them that we're seeing the Western companies now copying. Facebook copied TikTok with Lasso. Amazon is copying Alibaba with the new retail. The new retail is a very strong area in China today, where you have robotics and AI and data all programmed into retailers today. So anyhow, those are all sectors that I think China is leading for the future, and we'll see more of these coming up.
Yeah, I also see a deep bench out of China. So, at Google, we noticed that there's so many developers in China, literally hundreds of thousands of them, developing apps for overseas users. And some of these guys have never set foot in outside of China. So, but yet they're doing well. You know, we just discovered one company that they're like Match.com. So they have like 15 different apps focusing on all these niche sectors. You know, for example, senior people dating, or blind people dating. They have all these apps. You know, and none of them is launched in China. They're making a lot of money. So it's just selling apps. Yeah. So then in-app purchase and all that stuff. Subscription. And that's actually a very very big deal. It's a huge economy. So everybody knows that everybody hears that Google is out of China. Google actually is not. We have a huge business in China. It's mostly B2B, right? B2C is done. No consumers can access any Google servers. But that didn't stop developers from developing apps and they use Google platform to launch it overseas. And then overseas, that's what they do. They make a lot of money. And Google also benefited from it. It's one of the biggest market, many people didn't know. So it's like people like those that I've been watching up to. So, and then before you know it, they become the next Pinduoduo, they become the next Qitoutiao.
It's interesting that when you talk to the venture capitalists like you, and sometimes you're surprised by ideas that you're seeing springing up. And think, oh, how did that happen? It came out of nowhere. Like Pinduoduo was missed by a lot of venture capitalists, and all of a sudden, this huge company is number 2 in China in e-commerce. It came out of nowhere, basically.
Yeah, or even number 1 company in Africa, right? The only thing they do is enable feature phones to swap files. Like, why is that even useful? But then, how many million people use it on a weekly basis? So it's full of surprises. And this guy has never been to Africa. So.
Any questions from the audience? Yes.
Yeah, so I had a question. You guys talked about that there are companies which are banned in China, for example, Twitter, Google, Facebook. But it seems like there's a disparity. Like those companies have been banned for a long time, but US just bans one, Huawei, and it's a big deal. So why is there like such disparity, and like how is it being perceived in China? Are people also talking about it? Why are you banning companies from US?
The question is, the last sentence, again, just repeat
Like,
your
are
question.
people talking about in China also?
Yeah.
Why, like, are they standing up and saying that why Chinese government is banning US companies which are just doing like stuff which they already have, a Chinese version of it?
I don't think they know they exist.
But like everybody around the world knows it exists, right? Like how Huawei exists now. Now they know that they make 5G equipment. But it got banned, so people are talking about it in US. We are in US and New York talking about it, and there are people from US talking about that. They say that it's wrong. So have they started similar conversation? And I'm pretty sure that these companies have been banned for a longer time. So what is going around with that? Because it seems like it's very disparate though. Like
Yeah.
so many companies banned for such a long time, and which enable these Chinese companies to become so big.
True.
And now, this is a question I don't want to like lecture, but
Yeah,
just get your opinion.
people could argue that was an unfair advantage
So
to
like,
allow
what
the
is your
Chinese
take on
companies to
it?
get
What is
ahead.
your, since you have been covering it for such a long time, what is your take? Are people in China, how do they feel about it?
I don't think they talk too much about it, really. They don't talk too much about Google, Facebook,
But
Twitter.
have you asked that question though? Like, have you asked people at least who have started those companies, who have copied exactly the same business model, what they think about it?
Well, yeah, I did, and definitely I've been covering that for a long time, and my first book, Silicon Dragon, goes into that in detail. But I think today it's just pretty much accepted that these American companies are not going to be in their universe, and they're going to have their own, what they consider better models for their own uses than Facebook could offer, than Google could offer, than Twitter could offer. WeChat has become, you could do so many things with WeChat today, and we don't have an equivalent of that in the US. And so
I
I
would
think
argue WhatsApp was there, right? So, like,
WhatsApp is not popular in China.
and
It's
that's the
popular
whole
in
point of
India.
it, because you banned everything there, so they have to come up with something, right? Like how it's happening with, like Huawei is banned here, so some US company will start making 5G later on, right? Like because there's a gap in the market.
I don't think it's necessarily totally related just to a ban,
Okay.
but anyhow.
I think we have a question.
But can I
I
get
would
your
like
opinion
to-
also?
Should we move on?
Yeah, I'd like to go on with the easy example. Let's see what happened to the USSR. And isn't that something that is a danger for China? To keep people out, to keep the truth and the freedom out, and ultimately it has to come through, as it came through in Russia.
Well, it's coming through now in Hong Kong.
Yeah, for instance.
I think some of the better informed people knew about Google and Facebook, and that they complain a lot. We used to have a lot of fun watching them. Every time I made a mistake, then people complain about them. People are like, "What is Google?" There's just a portion of the population. But then, as Rebecca said, people know that's not going to happen. There's refusals, fueled.
There was an excellent article in the Wall Street Journal today about the future of money, and talking about how starting next year, China is going to have digital currency and move more toward having the renminbi become digital. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the impact that will have on the tech sector.
So in theory, that'd be great, right? So that reduces friction in many ways. However, I am, sorry, I'm gonna screw it to my lips.
It's a new invention.
Yeah, I'm gonna do this, touch it. I'm not sure, everything is in the implementation. I hope they can do a good implementation. Typically, whenever something is done by the government, they screw up. Yeah, I'm eager and I look forward to that.
This is just a question for probably for Mr. John Wei. So in terms of the example of Ofo and mobile, that because you're one of the investors, right? And then obviously you lost the money, but
Do we have to talk about this again?
so I'm just asking a question. So if you think back, right? If you think back, what you could have done or what you would have done differently from before to make this journey more toward what you expected, and or meaning that are you going to, or do you think in general investors in China are less likely to take the risks of investing the money to more startups?
Yeah, so I mean, there are tactical things, there are also strategic things. Tactically, you would say, look, so-and-so is a bad guy, right? I put it mildly, and then don't believe everything they said. The investors are not all good, right? Not all honorable. This young person was too trusting to some people, especially big name people. Then the other part is, look, let's not get greedy. We got our 50x, maybe 75x. Let's cash it. So, we know there's something that's not that solid. Everybody was overly optimistic. If you go back to early part of last year, right, all the Chinese investors were saying, look, we're long-term optimistic about China market, pessimistic about US market. Because, if you see the startups, they raise 3 rounds of capital every year, right, in China. Of course, they jump in valuation. And I am here, making my investment, doing my due diligence, and all my companies are raising their capital every 12 months or 18 months. And of course, I look very bad, again, that's the capital at work. Capital is really having some short-term effect on these guys. So that's the strategic part.
So do you think investors are less likely nowadays?
Well, yeah, it's also not a bad choice because if you try to raise R&D fund today, it's next to impossible. So the money has dried up.
Yes.
I was wondering if you had some dreams for what the next leap in technology could do, and whether, for example, for someone like Jack Ma saying he's going full-time into education and SDGs, whether that actually might be something that actually the whole of Asia wants, and maybe is rather different from the advertising models that have led so much of Silicon Valley. So I have my own bias there, but I also wonder, if everything went right, what could be the next leaps forward, whether it comes from China or all of the sort.
Yeah, so lady first.
6G is coming up, right? People say 5G is not even going to have that big of an impact. It's all going to be 6G, So anyhow, 6G will be here soon enough. But yeah, it will be interesting to see if there are some new ideas that come out of China and from Jack Ma and his visionary abilities in the education space. I think China could use an upgrade in the way classrooms, the kind of memorization and black and white kind of learning, and could use more of the kind of creative, unconventional, out-of-the-box thinking that the U.S. has. Maybe Jack Ma, who has had exposure now to the Western world for many years, could develop something like this and get it going in China. He certainly has enough money to put into it, and you could probably get some great managers for it and make it something that's nationwide in China and help improve the whole educational system or healthcare. There's a lot of problems in China that need to be solved, but I think he's one of the areas that he's focusing on is education.
I have 2 questions, one for Rebecca. I want to ask you about the role of the government has played in the tech giants we have talked here. Because that's the U.S. government has pointed to a lot, and we have seen some state-backed VC money and some companies work through government contracts. So do you think what kind of role the Chinese government has played in the booming tech scene there, and if that's necessarily a threat to the U.S.? And the question for Wei is that we have seen tightening scrutiny on a lot of Chinese investment money in the US, like the CFIUS you talked about. Does that make you more cautious when you as investor look at investment in the US? Thanks.
Those are two really great questions. The second one was so good, I almost forgot the first. Because I can see Wei, I'm visualizing Wei answering, and that's all that's in my mind right now. But, let Wei go first.
Okay. So CFIUS stands for Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S. So CFIUS, there was a new law introduced or signed by President Trump on August 13th last year. So basically, the law says, getting close. So the law says, if you're a foreign fund, you cannot make investment in U.S. startups, technology startups, without applying going through the proper procedure. So the procedure goes basically, you have to file a 5-page application. You have to wait for 45 working days before you send your money. And then you have to pay up to 1% of the transaction fee to the government as a process fee. So basically that makes VC investment impossible. So because no good deal would wait for 45 working days for you, just for you, right? And bad deals, you don't want to invest anyway, they'll wait for you. That's why a lot of foreign funds, especially Chinese funds, stop investing in the US.
Chinese companies specifically?
So the law says foreign fund, but the friendly countries are still making their investments. So that's the part. So of course that makes the foreign investors not just cautious, but stop making investment. But in my case, I set up my own fund, so I'm a U.S. citizen. So what differentiates a U.S. fund from a foreign fund is the top GPs must be U.S. persons. Right, that's one
This is
requirement.
a new restriction.
Right, that's a new law, part of the law.
And it's creating restructuring of VC funds in Silicon Valley.
Yeah, you must do a U.S. fund before you can invest. Otherwise, if you're a Chinese fund, it's virtually impossible. And then it also have some requirements on the LP part. LP is a limited partner and investor to the funds. So the foreign LPs cannot veto the U.S. GP's decisions. They cannot get the non-public material information from the portfolio companies.
That makes them totally ineffective.
Yeah, make them passive investors.
Right.
So
And on the government question, that's the number one question that everyone wants to know: how much influence does the government have over these tech titans? Certainly, the government is setting these priorities, these national agendas for greenlighting investments in certain areas. The government has a tech fund. The government has designated certain sectors where they're going to lead in the next few years. And the government when the government greenlights a sector, then the VCs jump in and you see a lot of development in those areas. Now, there are a lot of cases too where you could talk about it politically, but I think I'll stay away from that right now.
So wait, going back to your earlier point, are we going to see more Chinese funds pulling out of the U.S. given?
I have.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Untitled Ventures did, Kaika's fund. They're out of the U.S.
Two quick questions. You mentioned when U.S. companies move and enter into China, there's localization, then there's a need for a so-called field commander. What's the profile of a field commander? Is it a tech person or is it a business person? Or is that facilitated through an investment typically? What's the optimal scenario there?
Can you repeat that question with the microphone? There we go.
I'm sorry. So when a U.S. company, can you hear me? When a U.S. company at some point enters the Chinese market in terms of localization and having somebody, it's all about management in the local scene. You use the word a field commander, which is familiar with the space there. For a tech company, would that profile of that person be a tech person, or is it a business person, or is that facilitated through an investment?
That's a question for me?
Yeah.
Okay. I was really referring to technology companies getting into China. So this person must know technology, and this person must be able to communicate clearly with the headquarters, with the mothership. Then this person also must know the local market really, really well. And then, ideally, this person, had a entrepreneurial flair. So I think these are the key elements. But it's very hard to find these guys.
Oh, yeah,
There's not that many kind of Steve Jobs type characters in China, but there are beginning to be more and more of them that were inspired by the generation of these heroes like Jack Ma.
Yeah. One practical issue is that if you found such a guy, why would this person work for you?
Thanks for taking my question. So when we were talking about some of the obstacles that China is facing, we talked about how the U.S. is never going to let Huawei infrastructure happen, and a lot of other countries are following suit. I think it would kind of be appropriate to discuss, why. And we haven't really gotten there. My question is, some of the Chinese government's policies concern people in the West. And I guess my question is, although these Chinese tech titans have benefited from not having competition, the firewall works both ways, are we at a point now where these companies now want the Chinese government's policies to change so that they could be accepted into the free market of commerce? Is it in the best interest for these tech titans to possibly try to reform some of these policies, or are they actually still benefiting to this day from having 1 billion people in their market and no competition? I'm just trying to figure out where they're at, because being global still seems to be, is it a dream, or are they just very happy with playing in their sandbox? It's a big sandbox.
yeah.
It's a big sandbox, but they're very ambitious, and I think it is a protected market. I don't see that changing anytime soon. I think they will continue to grow bigger and bigger in China and extend that muscle into as many markets as they can overseas. If it's not the US, then other markets.
Yeah, I agree with Rebecca's assessment. And if I can take one step back, I think this is really a good question, fair question. And I've been there, I've witnessed, from the front line, all the unfair treatments, like intellectual property issue, unfair restrictions to the foreign companies, eBay and Google. All these questions are real. If there's a technical question to ask, is how pervasive these things are, and also, out of what motives that the Chinese government is doing that. At what level, right? Sometimes it's at local government level, sometimes central government level. My impression, my observation is rather that these are addressable questions. Sometimes you just slap them on the wrist. Sometimes harder than other times. There are different ways to achieve that. What we had a discussion earlier, we don't want to see as throw out the baby with the bathwater. Because the two economies are so symbiotic. They're both sides to benefit from it. We share some of the synergies. So, and then the second part of the question, at a more practical level, is I'm not convinced that Baidu actually benefited overall, by not having Google in China. If I'm a Baidu investor, I would think otherwise. Look at where they are now, right? So they lost their motives, or motivation, they lost their energy without Google.
So do you think that sentiment is shared across the technology space within China? That's what could lead?
Yeah, unless you're Robin Lee yourself, right? Everybody I know feels the way I felt. I'm a good friend with Baidu's #1 employee, which is the CTO. So I know he feels that without Google, they kind of lost. So.
Yeah, that's
that's really interesting. So I did want to just add one other comment, that I think your question about the Chinese government and the tech titans, and sort of related to your question too, is that the government wants to be the biggest, the giant, right? These tech giants have become so huge that they're almost a threat they're influencing so much of the economy today in China that the government, I think has a certain amount of, feeling that we need to keep them under control. And I have heard this story of, basically that Jack Ma was pushed out. He was becoming too powerful. And so it's something to watch.
You mentioned before that these Chinese tech giants are trying to make inroads in Southeast Asia. And with this two technology systems, where would Southeast Asia fall between the American and the Chinese system?
Interesting. The American companies are investing in Southeast Asia too. But I think the Chinese companies have been a little more aggressive in going in, that into the ride-hailing space, into the e-commerce space, into the mobile payments space. All the same sectors that mattered in China are also in Southeast Asia. And so I think right now I give the edge, a slight edge to China. If you look at Amazon has been aggressively investing in India, but they don't really monopolize the market. Walmart has gone in there as well, and they don't really monopolize the market. So the American companies are not exactly winning over Southeast Asia.
Yeah, you talked about the trade war and said the 5G. Do you anticipate that this country will a real attempt of decoupling the two societies altogether? Do you think that's realistic? Do you think American industry is really interested in doing that?
Is decoupling realistic?
It's so interwoven, or it has been interwoven. Take years to decouple. That's my thing.
Yeah, it's very tough to completely decouple.
But even looking at the supply chain stuff as well, I mean, it's so global. How do you manufacture everything from either America or China?
It's impossible.
Yeah, but the Chinese part is hurting. There in some sectors, they do see migration. Part of the supply chain is migrating. It used to be that if you're a Silicon Valley startup, you want to make some hardware, right? You just go to Shenzhen, one stop, and talk to all the suppliers that you need to talk to. You're done. But in some sectors, you have to maybe talk to somebody in Vietnam and Malaysia.
But
So,
you may not get the same quality from there that you get in China.
yeah, certainly not the convenience.
Not the convenience. And there's some parts, some businesses, they can only get their components from China right now. They don't have a choice.
There are also, many tricks that the people are playing. So the current the current restriction is really on the tariff side, right? But there are so many things people can do. Sorry.
China's always on.
Yeah. Yeah. So with the trade war going on, so eventually I guess there will be some concession, right? So for both actors, would you guess eventually the market in China will be opening up to the American technology companies, or it's totally local?
Well, some technology companies are there, but certain others in the internet and content space and digital entertainment, that's a struggle.
Not going to happen.
The censorship, yeah, but American tech companies are there. Microsoft's there, Apple's there.
Yeah, I think when I hear this, I associate your question to the gentleman's question too. I feel there's definitely some positive effect that's taking place. And then, when Trump started the trade war, there are actually a lot of hope, a lot of encouragement, or a lot of inspiration felt in China. People are joking that they call Trump the second generation of chief architect for China. China's reform and opening, right? So the first one was Deng Xiaoping. So they were like, this is a forced opening, right, and reform. And I think it's a tough negotiation. It's very complicated. So there are technical things. I wish the U.S. had done better or done less, whatever. Right? There are always these things. But I think overall, I feel this is something that somebody must address. But address in what fashion is the more technical question.
All right, I think we're out of time, so we can continue the conversation after this discussion.
And book signing too.
Yes. Thank you so much, Rebecca.